you have your Bibles, I encourage you to turn to 1 Corinthians chapter 11. 1 Corinthians chapter 11. As we get into chapter 11, it begins a section where Paul deals with worship concerns. In fact, it goes from chapter 11 through chapter 14, and so all the things that are involved here have something to do with worship when you come together. In fact, it's a phrase that we'll see throughout the entire context through to the end of chapter 14, when you come together and when you come together. And so the first one that he begins to address is that of head covering, and that's what we're going to deal with tonight, is the idea of head covering. So these are, chapters 11 through 14 is worship concerns. So we think of it from that perspective. We looked at or finished last week with chapter 10 and the finishing of the idol foods controversy and so forth. And let me back up just a second here, because we had a question come up on verse 29 and 30, especially verse 30, about the question, and Paula was the one who asked the question. And I don't feel like I really gave it a good explanation for what is happening. And so I went back and made a couple of notes here on these two questions that he asks in 29 and 30. I want to readdress those. For why should my liberty be determined by someone else's conscience? If I partake with thankfulness, why am I denounced because of for which I give thanks? And so the idea is, what does Paul mean here? It almost appears like he's contradicting everything else he said. Why should I be governed by someone else's conscience? I'll do whatever I want to do as long as I'm thankful for it. And yet we determined this idea that Paul really is denying the liberty of eating food offered to idols. That's his basic conclusion is don't eat that food. And so there's probably one of the more difficult passages in this section in verses 8 through 10. But these two rhetorical questions are difficult to fit into the context. And so sometimes some commentators and scholars have said, well, these two questions were actually notes that someone had put in the margin, and that through time some scribe messed up and thought that these questions that he had, or that this previous scribe or previous study reader had, then got moved over into the text. And so they say it's a glossing of a marginal note. That would be the technical term, a marginal gloss that was added by some scribe. The problem is there's no evidence for that. There are no, we do have some instances possibly where that has happened, but in all the instances where it's thought that may have happened, there's a textual variant there that some manuscripts have it, some manuscripts don't have it. And so we say, well, with the difference in the manuscripts, then we've got to discern which. There's no discrepancy among any of the manuscripts about the inclusion of these two questions, and so it doesn't appear at all that's what's happening. Another idea is that Paul is defending his own past actions. Paul maybe used to eat food that had been offered to idols, and now he's trying to justify that, even though he's telling them not to. But the problem is in light of Paul's absolute prohibition against it, it's doubtful that Paul ever knowingly ate food offered to idols. As a Jew who was he was a Hebrew among Hebrews, right? A Pharisee of Pharisees. He was, according to the law, blameless. And so participating in some idol worship ceremony would have been unthinkable for Jewish Paul prior to his Christian conversion. Once he became a Christian, I don't see that particular scruple would be changed in any way. And so I don't think it's Paul simply trying to justify some past action. Another idea is that Paul is admonishing the weak Christians not to abuse the forbearance of the strong Christians. And so we oftentimes hear, or we focus on the weak versus the strong, and if the weak can't figure out what the scriptures teach or what God requires, and they have some oddball interpretation or understanding, that the weak, or the strong rather, are to forbear with them. And to the weak I became the weak mentality. And so if the weak thinks that this can't be done, then the strong. So we always hear it from the strong changing his attitude and happening toward the weak. But some have suggested that in these two questions, Paul is saying, okay, while the strong needs to bear with the weak should not use that and abuse that and say, well, I don't like what he's doing over there, so I'm going to say that offends my conscience, so he'll stop doing it. And so that's the idea. I don't think that that one really fits the bill. Number one, I don't think Paul's really addressing the weak versus strong as he does in Romans chapter 14. I don't think that's the argument here either. Another idea is that Paul shifts to a diatribe format. Diatribe simply means that I've made a statement, but now I'm going to bring up possible objections to my statement, and then I'm going to answer those objections. And so he might be saying something like, some of you might say, and then he's asking the question, how can I let my liberty be determined by someone else's conscience? And so then Paul would go on to address those things. The problem is there's really not an answer to these questions. In fact, they're not even offered, as a question that needs to be answered. The questions themselves are rather offered more, as a furtherance. Notice the word for. When we see the word for, especially at the beginning of a sentence, but and a lot of times in every other case, it indicates that what is coming next is an explanation of what has just been said. And so what has just been said, but if someone says to you, this has been offered to idols, then don't eat it, but for the sake of the one who informed you and for the sake of the conscience. I do not mean your conscience, but his. For. He's going to explain that statement, it appears. Why should my liberty be determined by someone else's conscience? And so that's what some people would say, that he's given a diatribe. The problem with the diatribe explanation, too, is that normally when Paul goes, because he does use the diatribe some, he will say, some of you would say, or some of you may ask, or you may wonder, or there's no introducing phrase that would indicate he's shifted from what he's telling them to what they might bring up in objection. So it doesn't, to me, appear that it would be the diatribe. I think the best explanation is that verse 28 and 29a, the first part of 29, is really a parenthetical statement, an aside, if you would. So what you have at the end of verse 27, if one of the believers invites you to dinner and you are disposed to go, eat what is set before you without raising any questions on the ground of conscience. Now, if verse 28, and remember, in the original, we don't have the autographs, but the way Greek was written at the time of the writing of Corinth, the Corinthians, is that they used all capital letters, they used no spacing, and they used no punctuation. Okay, so just one of the great puzzles is determining where a word begins and where a word ends. And so we were helped along in that endeavor by later manuscripts called minuscules, which do offer spacing between the words, and they're written in upper and lower case and things like that. So we have some help with later manuscripts, but the original manuscripts didn't have those things. And so how would you determine a parenthetical statement? You had to go solely by the context. But what a parenthetical statement is, it's as if he's made this statement, now he's going to turn aside and add some additional information and then come back to the original statement. So let's read it that way for just a moment, taking out verse 28 and the first part of 29. Eat whatever is set before you without raising any question on the ground of conscience. For why should my liberty be determined by someone else's conscience? If I partake with thankfulness, why am I denounced because of that for which I give thanks? And so if I don't know that it's idol food and I give thanks for it, then I shouldn't be condemned or denounced by that for anyone. And then your aside is if someone says to you, this has been offered to idols, and eat what's set before you. But as an aside, if they're setting it before you, and as they're setting the plate down, they say, by the way, this was offered to such and such God, then you can't eat. That to me makes the most sense. Tim?
I've heard it explained a couple times. When someone has made it an issue.
Okay.
I've pointed out this is an issue that you need to, and they're watching to see how you respond.
It might be, but it may be, listen, if the host is innocent and they're just saying, praise be Zeus for the food that is before us, and sets the food down, as a Christian, I think Paul is saying don't eat that food. Even if the host does not mean it to be a test. But I think you're right. I think there are some who are making an issue of it, some who are not making an issue of it. But if I know that the food is idol meat, I cannot eat it. And I think that's Paul's statement. All right, Terry?
So when they refuse to eat it, what would often happen to them for refusing to eat that food offered to them?
Well, the great fear going into a meal like that would be that you would be an outcast. So if this happened to be your patron who took care of you, if it happened to be your master and you were a slave in the household, if it happened to be your boss and you were a freedman working for him, it could mean your job and livelihood. If it were friends, you could be cast, a social outcast at that point. And so there were those, if you didn't eat, there were some social ramifications of it. But of course, Paul's point in verse 13 of chapter 10 is it doesn't matter. That those possible trials, even if they do come to fruition, God will enable you to endure those things. So that would be, now, how I say social ramifications. Look, if the host got up and wanted to fight because you refused to eat, do a physical fight or challenge you to a duel to death, I guess it could cost you your life, but I don't think that was common. I think it would be more of a social outcast situation as opposed to a physical endangerment. But hey, I don't live in 1 Corinthians or 1st century Corinth, so I don't know exactly what the full ramifications could have been. Yes?
What can happen today to you if you refuse to do something that people don't want you to do? I mean, they want you to do it.
Well, I think in a lot of ways the ramifications will still be the same. You may be a social outcast. You may be disowned by your family. You may be fired from your job. Depending on what people are wanting you to do, I guess it could escalate to the level of physical endangerment. Although I tend to think in situations like these, it's going to be more the social, emotional issues that we have to deal with. Mark?
Parenthetical idea you're talking about, in verse 27 when it says, eat anything that is set before you without asking questions for conscience sake, that's talking about the person that's going to eat it for his conscience at that point.
I kind of think so.
I mean, wouldn't you ask it for your own conscience sake?
Well, he said don't ask for your own.
Or that's what I'm saying.
Yeah, so you would avoid asking
You don't ask.
on the grounds of your conscience. Yes, I think so.
But then when you get down to 29 and you start again, for why is my freedom judged by another's conscience, that conscience.
That appears to be the other. So if it's if it's a parenthetical, then it would appear to me then that verse 29, conscience, identifies verse 27, conscience, is the same thing.
But then it says, why is my freedom judged by another's conscience? So I'm saying he goes into it telling him not to
Yeah.
ask because of your conscience. So for why is your freedom judged by another's, it doesn't seem to fit. It would.
Yes, and that's the issue that I think last week what I said is that the understanding of this passage, that first of all, just the wording of how Paul puts it out is difficult to really to translate in a way that is smooth to us in English or understandable in English. And so there are questions. I wouldn't say that the parenthetical is without issues itself. I just think it has fewer issues than the other interpretations, if that makes sense. Terry?
And could the one that invited you already know you're a Christian? And they could just say, this has been offered as a warning. This has been offered to Zeus.
They could.
And then for both your consciences, for your conscience, for conscience sake, he could be warning you, and for his conscience, he needs to warn you because he knows you're a Christian. And for your conscience, you can't do it if you know who it's offered to.
When
Both consciences?
yes, I mean I can't say no. I mean I obviously in view here there's both being under consideration, your conscience and their conscience, and the way the ESV reads here, it doesn't really allow for the idea of the shift of a parenthetical, but in the original I would say that could be allowed for. But yes, that's part of the issue is when he says in verse 27 on grounds of conscience, go ahead and eat without questioning it. It sounds like your conscience, but then in verse 29, as Mark pointed out, it looks more like it's going to be their conscience, and which one is in view there. So, like I say, none of the interpretations, I think, are without problems. But I think the end result is that we don't eat food offered to idols. Period. Unless we don't know, and that's the caveat that Paul is giving in verse 27 and 26. Is if you don't know, just go ahead and eat it. If you know that it has been offered to idols, don't eat it. Paul?
I mean, this isn't going to happen to us in this context, but all of those issues that just came up are all great points for a learning moment with somebody. I mean, well, somewhere in that conversation, there's going to be, well, why won't you? Or
Yeah.
why do you do it this way? Or what does it matter? And all of that has an opportunity for you to start telling them why in a good way. As far as the conscience things go, it says that was worded as, why does someone else's conscience determine my liberty? And I'm wondering if it means that so I don't offend their conscience, I'm willing to give up my liberty. And that's kind of how I see that so I don't offend them or make them stumble, I will give up my liberty to help them. Because he goes into the next phrases, is try to please everybody. And I think they're related in some way, shape, or form.
And pleasing everyone is not easy.
Awesome.
Well, really, isn't he saying you don't do it because you don't want to offend the other person's conscience? But my conscience is clear even though I eat it. I'm not eating it because of him, not because of me. It doesn't affect my conscience. My conscience is clear, but I'm not eating it because I don't want to violate his conscience.
And that may be a good explanation of it. Of course, my conscience would be violated, or should be violated, if I know the meat is offered to an idol and I eat anyway.
Well, no, what I'm saying, it's his conscience that's causing the problem. My conscience is clear of doing something. I mean, you might, I guess, you do things with your conscience clear because, well, I don't know. I so I don't do it because I don't want to violate his conscience, but my conscience is, if I
Right.
would eat the meat, my conscience would still be clear. So I'm not eating it because I don't want to violate his conscience.
I know that you know, that I know that you know.
Okay, I'll
That-
put my hand down there.
But you're right, but yes, so the conscience issue, and of course, Romans 14 is, going to address that as well, but as Paul would say in chapter 9 here, even at the conclusion of chapter 8, if eating meat offends my brother, I won't eat meat. And so that kind of goes back to,
And that's what he's saying. I'm not gonna do it because it's gonna.
right, over here first.
So I'm just trying to maybe put this in perspective a little bit by using another example. By substituting meat for like alcohol. Because nowadays, maybe we don't offer food to gods or whatever, but we're offered to drink or alcoholic beverages. And if someone tells you, well, you're a Christian, you shouldn't drink at all, even though we know, being drunk is the sin. It doesn't say anything about social drinking, but if it causes somebody to think, oh, well, Christians can drink and they can be drunk, then that'll cause them to stumble. So then we should not do it. Not for our conscience because we're no different, but because they'll think something and their conscience will be hindered.
And that's true. There's a lot of people that their understanding of Christianity, and I think in this same case, is very shallow. And so, you're a Christian, you shouldn't eat food offered to idols. You're a Christian, you shouldn't drink. You're a Christian, you shouldn't. And so we have all of these things, and they're very, and it goes back to what Tim was saying, is trying to judge us based solely upon what little Christianity they know. And that is an issue here. And so, is this person testing them by putting the food before them? Hold on just a second, Althea. And then, go ahead, Terry.
And that portion doesn't say, don't eat it, and then judge that person for eating it. It says, don't eat it, period. Because your conscience would be judged. You would judge your own conscience. If you have a clear conscience and you know that's offered to an idol, you're going to judge yourself and say, oh, I did something horrible.
Yes. Now here's an issue. I don't think that the person who's setting the food before them is a Christian.
That's right. And so the Christian sets the example because Jesus set the example for us.
Right. But he's not going to, he's not going to hold this non-Christian accountable to his Christian scruples.
Right, so he's just not going to eat it, period.
Yeah. He's not going to eat, and if his host wants to eat, that's fine. And hopefully he can just go, hey, we'll agree to disagree over eating the meat past the vegetables.
And then he'll take his punishment, whatever he does.
Yes. Althea?
Getting back to his example of the drinking part,
Mm-hmm.
whether they're Christian or not, you still could be causing someone to stumble
Yeah.
in that example.
Right. Setting the example, you could cause people to go against their conscience, to do things they shouldn't do. Absolutely. So, Christian or non-Christian, we have to be aware of our example.
Didn't you say to turn to chapter 11?
I did. Hold on a second. One more, and then we do have to go to 11. Tim.
I'm just gonna throw some more mud in the fire. Know of an instance where a group of individuals came up with the idea that communion at the evening service was offensive.
Okay.
And it went to the point that it literally broke up the congregation.
Yeah.
And it destroyed that congregation because a few individuals says, use this right here. This offends me, so you can't do it.
Yeah.
Tried multiple ways to work around it. We'll go to a separate room in the building. You don't have to be a participant. We'll go to a separate, nope, that still offends me. No matter what scriptures you gave saying what logic you used, nothing mattered. Now, presented an idea where the majority of the Christians, first century, could they have been slaves? All probability, some were.
We know somewhere, yes.
Now, if that slave says, I'm sorry, I can't serve you breakfast because my communion at church is this morning, what's going to happen to that slave? He's not going to be a slave much longer.
Yeah. His livelihood would probably be, dry up.
Very terminated.
Yeah.
But the thing is, when you have such a closed mind that you focus on pulling scripture out of context and applying it to your wants and needs, you can prove just about anything.
So that, to me, falls under that this other idea here that that Paul is admonishing weak Christians not to abuse the forbearance of the strong Christians, and that to me is exactly what they're doing in that situation. If the weak Christian is strong enough to go to Scripture and say, this is the way it is, and you've got to kowtow to me, then I would tell you they're not weak. They're belligerent.
That's the correct word.
I think in some of these issues, Tim just brought up a good point, in my opinion, and that is that the question shouldn't be, am I offended? The question should be, is God offended?
And then number 2, am I offending someone else? And then number 3, am I offended? Ron?
Well, I think there's a difference between causing someone to stumble and someone being offended.
Yes.
And in our society, anything can offend anybody.
And does.
They can claim that, but that's different than causing someone to stumble or embolden someone to sin. Those are two different things.
Right.
And I think people use the word offense in a non-biblical sense of saying that offends me.
Right.
But it's causing them to stumble, which is different.
Yeah.
Because
And
they say stumble is stumble, not grumble.
stumble and not grumble. So yeah, of course the idea of causing someone to stumble in the English, and I love the Greek word that underlines that is skandalizein. It's where we get scandal, to scandalize. And what is it about our lives that scandalize us before God? It's sin. And so if I've caused someone to sin, right, to stumble, to sin, then I'm guilty. But just because I've offended someone, hurt someone's feelings, or said something to them that they disagreed with, look, disagreement today is now, it is the height of sin. If you disagree with me, not only is there a disagreement, but you are sinned and destined for an eternity of hell, and the fires cannot be hot enough for you because you disagreed with me. And that's the sensibility that a lot of us have. And so, like Ron is pointing out, it's more than a offense. We're talking about you've caused someone to sin. And so, in the example that Hugo gave, if our actions have caused someone to, start drinking and enter into drunkenness, our actions are sinful because we've caused someone else to enter into sin. So those are real things that we need to be careful of. Mark.
Well, I don't want to go in chapter 11. Can you re-explain, because I've lost the point of what we're talking about here? Isn't the last part of chapter
It's
verse
the
30?
It's the 2 rhetorical questions, the second half of verse 29 and all of verse 30.
Because I'm thinking about Romans chapter 3, where Paul says, verse 8, as we are why not say as we are slanderously reported as some claim that we say, let us do evil that good may come, their condemnation is just. Is it not not a possibility that there's some outside slandering going, that's not justified. It's just slander.
Is that possible?
Well, I mean, that's what's going on in the end of verse 3. That
It could be, yeah.
that it's just outside slandering. It's not just,
The only,
it's just slander.
so the issue that I have with that, and again, there's issues with all the interpretation, possibilities I've given tonight, but he does not introduce this as someone is saying, or these words are what you might say or what someone else is saying, and then Paul's going to answer that, because he doesn't really answer it, and he doesn't introduce it as a possible slight or slander against him and his way. But
Which in Romans chapter 3, it is introduced that way.
yes.
But
But is it possible that does he have to always introduce it? No. In fact, even here in 1 Corinthians, we've said, for example, in chapter 7 and verse 1, I think that's the verse, where, it is good for a man not to touch a woman. Right there. In that statement, I take that to be Paul is quoting something they've said, but to my recollection, there's no introductory statement there. It's just the statement, it is good for a man not to touch a woman. But based upon the rest of the context of 1 Corinthians 7, I understand Paul not to be affirming that, but rather to be repeating that and then giving the rest of chapter 7 to show how that statement is not true. But again, he doesn't introduce the idea of a diatribe. He doesn't introduce that statement. And so is it possible that here he's doing the same thing? Yeah, I would say it's possible. That's what makes this statement or these two questions difficult. But, I think if you take it that way, there's an application that can be made. And if you take it as, picking up on the argument after the parenthetical, there's an application to be made. If you take it as, the idea of the weak versus strong, there's an application to be made. And I think the application to be made is the same on all of them, which is, if you know the food is offered to idols, don't eat it. So, teasing out the exact meaning of the two questions is not necessary to the overall context, which the lesson would continue to be the same. But I like to try to tease out the meaning. I like to understand.
And sometimes it gets away from you.
Huh? What? Bell hadn't rung yet.
Head coverings.
So he ends, I'll tell you, we're going to have to go on. He ends in verse 11, chapter 11 and verse 1, be imitators of me as I am of Christ. The implication, I think at the second half of that is, as I am an imitator of Christ. The actual statement is, I am of Christ or out of Christ. And so he may be saying that, be an imitator of me since I'm a Christian. But I really don't think that's what he's saying. I think Paul is saying, be an imitator of me as I am an imitator. And we have to kind of supply the word an imitator, or the phrase of Christ. Now, I commend you. And so this word now, oftentimes in Paul, especially in I guess all of these are letters, but it's a shift in thought. And we've already mentioned, that we're going to shift from idol foods now to worship concerns, and this is going to take us through chapter 14. Now, I commend you, and because you remember me in everything and maintain the traditions even as I delivered them to you. And so this word commend is the idea of praise. I praise you. I give you adulation. And so a lot of people look at this and say, well, see, this probably is not written by Paul. This was an interpolation by some later scribe or someone pretending to be Paul, because Paul praising them does not fit the tenor of the entirety of the letter. And the problem with that is the next time Paul praises them, they'll say, see, that can't be Paul, And the next time Paul praises him or says something good, well, that can't be Paul either. Well, it can be Paul. In fact, even in our modern letter writing, it's very common for us to, introduce a letter and give a buffer statement. This is what we call it in business writing, a buffer statement, which is you praise something or say something good about the other person before you go into what the issue or conflict is. And so that's generally how we write business letters. That's how Paul writes, isn't it? Go look at any of the letters that he's dealing with the people, with the church. He often starts out with all the good that they're doing. I've heard of your faith, 1 Thessalonians, for example. I've heard of your love and your faith and all these wonderful things, but here's this. Look at the letters in the book of Revelation to the 7 churches of Asia. I know your works, how you have suffered many wrongs, and yet you stand true you're still faithful. But this I have against you. So he begins with this praise or commendation, and so it's not unusual in the first century. In fact, it was a very common letter writing style. We see it even in the secular letters of Cicero and Seneca and others, how they would write to someone and tell them the good things about them, and then if there was an issue or a conflict, they would put that after that commendation. Well, what's going to happen here? Well, Paul's going to deal with some issues, and so he commends them. And always, when there's a conflict or when there's a disagreement in people, basic conflict resolution is find common ground, right? So if you are arguing with someone over maybe a matter of doctrine or a matter of procedure or how we're going to do something, find common ground. Agree with them where you can, right? That's not how it works on Facebook. I understand that. There's no agreement, right? If you disagree on one point, you disagree with all. But in reality, mature people look for that common ground. What can we agree on? Paul says, look, I commend you because you remember me in everything and maintain the traditions. Paradosis, tradition, the word for tradition is paradosis. And so it literally means handed down, or passed down. And so that's what tradition is. It's simply something that's passed down. And usually we use it in reference to teaching, and most often we're talking about we use it to mean things outside of the Scripture, or procedures of how we do things outside of the Scriptures. For example, it is tradition for us to have a tray with individual cups at the Lord's Supper, right? That's a tradition. Could we have just one cup? Sure. Could we have multiple cups, but don't put them in a tray? Just a couple of good-sized cups and pass them down the different rows? Sure, absolutely. On the bread, we generally have a loaf of bread per tray. Could we do one tray and put all the bread in one tray? Yeah. See, these are all traditions, and that's generally how we use this idea of traditions. But that's not the only way that it's used. I think Jesus used it that way in Matthew chapter 15 when he said that, in vain do they worship me, teaching for their doctrine the commandments or the precepts or the traditions of men. Okay, so that's one way that we use it is that, it's kind of the non-binding, passed down traditions that we use. Is there anything wrong with following those traditions? No, nothing wrong with following those traditions. Where does the problem come in? Huh? Yeah. What were they saying? You can't do it on Sunday night. They're binding those traditions. Now that's the issue in Matthew chapter 15. But then there's other traditions where Paul would say, for example, in 2 Thessalonians 3, that you mark those who are walking not according to the traditions that you have received of us. Okay? Well, obviously there, Paul is not saying, well, if they don't have, 3 trays for the communion, then you mark them. They're wrong because they don't have the traditions we have. No. What Paul is saying is the teaching which I have handed down. Remember, tradition means handed down. And so Paul, as an inspired apostle, handed down the teaching to the church. And I think that's exactly how he's using it here too, just as he did in 2 Thessalonians 3. You have maintained the traditions as I delivered them to you. Again, he's not talking about, how many songs before the Lord's Supper. He's talking about the inspired message of God, the teaching. Now, how do you tell the difference between parodosis in that sense and parodosis in the sense of the non-binding procedures? Context. It's the only way. That's exactly right. And so he says he's praising them because they have been able to keep that tradition. Verse 3. But, and so here's the adversative, but, good things are going on with you, proud of you, praising you for it, but I want you to understand that the head of every man is Christ, the head of the wife is her husband, and the head of Christ is God. Now, you'll notice the ESV translates the word gune as wife. Its generic meaning is woman, and it is feminine. And it's in contrast to aner, which is male and female. So keep that in mind because male and female throughout this context is an important contrast that Paul is making, right? And so this is the word for woman. Now, if you mean for a woman to be a wife, what word do you use in the Greek? Same word. It's no difference. There's not a tense. There's not an ending. There's no difference either way. She's a gune anyway. By the way, when you transliterate the upsilon into English, it becomes a Y. So you have, instead of Gune, you have Gyne, gyne. So gynecology is a woman doctor, right? So you have that. Okay, so the woman here, look, there's a lot of issues in this context, about what Paul means. One of the first ones that you run into is Paul talking about women in general, or is he talking about women connected to a husband? Right? And so the ESV obviously prefers the wife-husband relationship as opposed to the woman-man relationship. The fact is that it could actually be shifting meanings at different points in the context too, which makes it even easier to gain an understanding of what is happening. So the head of the wife is her husband, and the head of Christ is God. Now, as we look at this, the concept of head, so kephale in the Greek would be, if we were to transliterate this word, it would be, and so we have like encephalitis, which is a infection of the head. Sometimes I think I've got an infection of the head. So, an electroencephalograph has the same, so it just means head. But, it's used sometimes in an anatomical sense. In fact, that's its base meaning, is just talking about our head, right? But it's also used metaphorically to mean like the source. like the headwaters. We talk about a river's headwaters. It's talking about the source. The head of a family is the source of the family. Everyone coming from him. Another idea is authority. The head of the department. He's the one that's in charge, right? And then I'll just throw this out there as the last one, is the idea of preeminence. So, obviously he's not using this in an anatomical sense, right? Because then you would have the head of every man is Christ. Physically, Christ becomes our cranium. It doesn't fit. You know, he's obviously using it in a metaphorical sense. So that brings up the question, is he talking about source? Is he talking about authority? Or is he talking about preeminence? We'll have to look at that next week. If you would, let's pray together. Our Holy Father,